Hector Vela was 74 years old, a master leather craftsman with hands that had never stopped knowing what they were for. Lucia Vela was 71, an ethnobotanist who had spent 33 years learning what the earth holds when you know how to ask it. They had been married 46 years, and they had built everything they had through labor, not luck. On a Thursday morning in March, they paid $400 for a derelict limestone tannery on Catala Creek that the county of Zavala had been ignoring for 19 years, and everyone in the parking lot of the county annex watched them do it. The county assessor, a man named Bryce Fontaine, told the Catula Courier that afternoon it was the most expensive mistake two retired people in this county had made in recent memory. What Hector said to Lucia on the drive home was this: "There is something inside that building we have not seen yet." What they found inside did not have a name in any botanical record on Earth. 11 months later, the county of Zavala received a letter from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. But I need to take you back to the beginning. The Catala Creek Tannery had not processed a single hide in 19 years when the county of Zavala listed it for public sale on a Tuesday in February. It had been built in 1931 by a man named Aurelio Salazar, who had come north from Oaxaca with a knowledge of bark tanning that was older than the republic he was crossing into, and who had run the tannery for 34 years on the south bank of Catula Creek before his sons moved to San Antonio, and the economics of small batch leather production collapsed and the doors were closed in 1965 and not opened again. The county had acquired the property through a tax lien in 1988, when the last of the Salazar family stopped paying the assessments. It was listed in the county's surplus auction catalog between a broken hay baler and a decommissioned road grader, which told you everything you needed to know about how the county of Zavala understood what it was selling. The auction was held in the parking lot of the county annex building in Catala on a Thursday morning. It was March, and the South Texas sky was the pale white blue of a sky that has not decided yet what kind of day it intends to be. There were 14 people in the parking lot, and most of them were there for the hay baler. Hector Vela was standing at the back of the crowd, with his hat in his hands. He was 74 years old and built like a man who has spent half a century bending over a workbench, broad through the shoulders and narrow everywhere else, with a specific density in his hands that comes from a lifetime of working with tools and hide and thread. He had spent 38 years as a master leather craftsman operating out of a workshop behind his house in Carrizo Springs, doing the kind of work that brought customers from Austin and San Antonio, and once from as far as Santa Fe, though he had not publicized that last one, because the man who came from Santa Fe was difficult, and the boots had taken 6 months. He had retired 4 years ago, when the arthritis in his left hand reached a point where the fine stitchwork was no longer honest, and he had spent those 4 years in the particular hollowness of a craftsman who no longer has a craft to practice. Lucia Vela stood beside him. She was 71 years old and still moved with the quick, purposeful attention of someone whose job has always required her to notice things at ground level. She had spent 33 years as an ethnobotanist at the Southwest Research Institute in San Antonio, studying the relationships between indigenous plant communities and traditional land use practices in the Texas-Mexico borderlands. She had retired 18 months ago and had brought home 17 boxes of field notes, a standing desk, and a specific productive restlessness that expressed itself as a very clean house and a garden that was running out of room for new ideas. She had been the one to find the listing. She had come across it in the county surplus catalog while she was looking for something else entirely, and she had stopped and read it twice, and then folded the catalog open to that page and set it in front of Hector's coffee cup on the Saturday morning before the auction. She did not say anything. Hector picked it up and read it and set it down. "Salazar Tannery," he said. "The listing says it is structurally compromised," she said. "Every listing in a county surplus auction says structurally compromised," he said. "It is how counties protect themselves from being sued by the next owner." "Aurelio Salazar," she said. He was Zapotec from the valley of Oaxaca. My grandmother's second cousin worked on this property in the 1940s. She used to talk about the smell of the tan bark. She said it smelled like the earth was thinking. Hector looked at the listing again. He looked at Lucia. "What is the opening bid?" he said. $200, she said. He picked up his coffee. He thought for a moment the way he thought about everything, from the inside out, turning it over without hurrying. "The tan bark," he said. "I know," she said. "A Zapotec tanner running a bark tannery in Texas in 1931, he said. He would not have used mesquite. He would not have used Texas oak." "No," she said. "He would not." They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the way that people look at each other when they have been together for 46 years, and a conversation has just become a decision without either of them having said so explicitly. "We have $460 in the household account after bills," Lucia said. "Keep 60, Hector said. "We might need gas." She folded the catalog closed. She went to get her coat. In the parking lot of the county annex building on Thursday morning, Bryce Fontaine stood at the auctioneer's table with the authority of a man who has been county assessor for 11 years and believes he understands the value of everything in Zavala County because it is his job to understand the value of everything in Zavala County. He was 57 years old, thick through the middle, with the sunburned neck and careful haircut of a man who plays golf on weekends and takes his institutional position seriously. He had appraised the Cotulla Creek Tannery property twice in the past decade, and on both occasions had concluded that the land was barely worth the cost of clearing the building off it. When Hector raised his card at $200, Fontaine looked at him with the patient expression of a man who has seen retired people make regrettable decisions at county auctions before. When no other card went up, Fontaine announced the sale in a tone that managed to convey congratulation and condolence simultaneously. The man standing next to Hector, a rancher named Aldous Pruitt, who had come for the hay baler, put his hand on Hector's shoulder and said, quietly and without meanness, that he hoped they knew what they were doing. Hector said they did not know exactly, which was the honest answer. Nobody bid against them. They ended the morning with $400 less than a tannery more, Lucia writing the check in her small, precise hand at the county annex table, while Fontaine watched with the expression of a man who has just sold someone a problem and feels appropriately conflicted about it. On the drive south from Cotulla, along the creek road, Hector drove, and Lucia kept her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the mesquite and the low scrub and the flat South Texas sky. Between them on the bench seat was a single object, a small leather-bound notebook the size of a paperback, worn at the corners and dark with age. Hector had made it for Lucia on the morning of their first wedding anniversary, stitching her initials into the front cover in the cobbled thread that was his signature, and they had used it together ever since as the book where the shared decisions went. It had held 46 years of those decisions, written alternately in his hand and hers. It was the only truly shared thing they owned. Lucia opened it to a fresh page. She wrote the date. She wrote, Cotulla Creek Tannery, $400, March. Then she left the rest of the page blank. The rest of the page was for what they would find. They went to the tannery that afternoon. The property was half a mile south of the county road on a gravel track that had been overtaken by cedar and scrub oak until the track was more suggestion than road. Hector drove the truck through it slowly, branches dragging along the sides until the track curved around a stand of live oak and the building came into view on the south bank of the creek. It was a long, low structure of limestone block, the same pale caliche limestone that was the building material of the Texas-Mexico borderlands from time immemorial, a material that absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly and asked very little from the people who built with it except patience. The roof was corrugated iron, old but present, rusted to a warm terracotta brown. One end of the building had a section of collapsed wall, limestone blocks tumbled inward, the edges of the collapse softened by decades of cedar encroachment. The rest of the walls stood. The windows were narrow and deep-set, built for airflow rather than light, the practical intelligence of a man who understood that a tannery in South Texas needed to breathe. Hector got out of the truck. He walked to the nearest wall and put his palm against the limestone. He pressed it flat and held it there a moment, the way he pressed leather when he was reading its condition, not testing temperature, but reading something deeper than temperature. "The blockwork is Zapotec pattern," he said. Lucia was already walking the perimeter, her eyes on the ground, on the base of the walls, on the way the cedar and scrub had taken the land in the 19 years since the county had stopped managing it. She noted without speaking that there were plants she recognized in the margins of the property, plants that did not simply blow in from the surrounding scrub. Specific plants. Plants that grew in proximity to human intention. "Hector," she said. He came to where she was standing at the south corner of the building. She was looking at a stand of low-growing shrub at the base of the wall, partially obscured by cedar. "Sumac," she said. "Rus trilobata, not native to this specific riparian corridor. Someone planted it." "For tanning," he said. "For tanning," she said. "And that is not the interesting one. Look behind it." He looked. Behind the sumac, in the deeper shadow at the base of the wall, was a plant he did not recognize. Lucia crouched and looked at it carefully and did not touch it. "I need to check something," she said. She went to the truck and came back with her field notebook and a reference text she had brought from Force of Habit, the specific force of habit of a field scientist who has not entirely accepted that she is retired. She compared the plant to 2 pages of the reference, and then she closed the book. "I do not know what that is," she said. She said it with the particular tone of a botanist who has been identifying plants for 33 years and has not often had cause to say it. Hector looked at her. "You do not know what it is." "Not from this literature," she said. "It is in the Anacardiaceae family, something in the sumac genus, but not a species I've encountered in Texas or in any Texas-Mexico borderlands survey I've read." Hector looked at the plant. He looked at the tannery. He looked at Lucia. "Come inside," he said. The main door was a wide timber door on iron pintles, padlocked with a county hasp and lock that their purchase paperwork gave them the right to cut. Hector cut it with the bolt cutters he had brought and swung the door open. The smell came out first. Old bark. Tannin. The mineral heaviness of ground that has absorbed decades of organic chemistry. And underneath it, something floral and resinous that was not mesquite and was not Texas oak and was not anything Hector could name from his 38 years of working with plant-tanned leather. He had worked with oak galls and chestnut and sumac and quebracho and hemlock and half a dozen other bark tannins in his career, and the smell that came out of the Catala Creek Tannery on that March afternoon in South Texas was not any of them. It was something older, something further south. They went in together. The interior was one long workspace, the floor packed earth darkened to near black with decades of tannin saturation. The vat pits were still in the floor, 4 of them, rectangular stone-lined pits built into the earth where the bark liquor had steeped the hides. They were dry now, the interior stone dark with old tannin, but structurally intact. The beamwork overhead was hand-hewn cedar, the joinery pegged rather than nailed, the specific pre-hardware store construction of a man who had learned to build before nails were cheap. The hide racks along the walls were still present, iron hooks in the limestone, the wooden rails still in their brackets. 2 of the rails had fallen. The others held. Hector moved through the workspace the way he moved through his own workshop, reading it with the professional literacy of a craftsman who knows what a tanning operation requires and can identify every stage of it by what it left behind. He crouched at the vat pits and looked at the stone lining. He examined the drain channels cut into the packed earth floor between the pits. He stood at the beamwork and looked at the joinery overhead. He did this alone, Hector said. "How do you know?" Lucia said. "The scale," Hector said. "The vats are the right size for one man working alone. Not a production operation, a personal operation. He was tanning for someone specific, custom work, not volume work. Lucia was at the far end of the workspace, where the limestone wall was thickest and the space deepened slightly, the ceiling lower. There was a door there, not the wide timber entrance door, but a narrower one, set into the wall, fitted with a different lock, newer than the pintles and older than the county hesp. She tried the handle. It did not move. She went and found Hector. He came and looked at the lock. It was a padlock through a hasp, the shackle older steel, not the county hardware. Someone had put this lock here separately from the county's work on the main door. Before the county acquired it, he said. Someone locked this themselves, she said, before the county ever had keys to the main door. He went to the truck for a different tool. The shackle was old enough that it cut. The door swung inward. The room behind it was small, no larger than a storage closet, perhaps 3 meters by 4. The walls were limestone block, the same as the main building. There were shelves along 3 walls, rough timber shelving built with the same practical precision as everything else in this tannery. And on the shelves, wrapped in oilcloth that had dried and stiffened but held, were bundles. Dozens of them, bark bundles. Hector understood immediately, the oilcloth wrapping the preservation method of someone who knew that bark tannin material was sensitive to light and moisture, and had wrapped it accordingly. Each bundle had a tag, a small paper tag in a consistent hand, the ink faded but legible in the light from their phones. The tags bore names, not English names, not Latin names, names in Spanish, and in something beneath the Spanish, older syllables, the naming system of a language that was working before Spanish arrived. But the bundles were not what stopped them. On the lowest shelf of the back wall, running the full length of the room, was a row of books. Not commercial books, handmade books, the covers stitched leather, each one roughly the size of a school composition book. There were 11 of them. The spines were unmarked. Lucia reached for the first one with the care of someone who has handled archival materials for 33 years and knows exactly what carelessness costs. She opened it. The pages were handmade paper, dense with writing, the ink brown with age but present. The writing was in Spanish, a formal period Spanish with the orthographic conventions of the early 20th century, the specific script of someone who had been educated in a language that was not their first, and who wrote it with the careful elegance of someone who valued the effort it represented. She read the first page. She turned to the second. She read 3 more pages without speaking. Then she looked up at Hector, and Hector, who had been watching her face the way he had watched her face for 46 years, because her face was the most reliable instrument he had ever found for reading the significance of a situation, understood before she said a single word that they had found something that went far beyond a tannery. "Hector," she said, "this is a record of tanning practice, specific tanning practice, plant by plant, species by species, with the Zapotec names and the Spanish translations and the processing notice." She turned to a page she had already marked with her thumb. He started writing this in 1932. He kept writing until 1963. 31 years, Hector said. 31 years of systematic documentation of tanning plants used by Zapotec tanners in the valley of Oaxaca and in the Texas borderlands. Some of these species' names, she said, and her voice was doing the specific thing it did when she was controlling something large. I have never seen in any ethnobotanical literature. Not in any survey of Oaxacan plant use I have read. Not in any borderlands survey. If these are accurate, Aurelio Salazar was documenting plant species and tanning practices that were never recorded by any academic institution. Hector looked at the row of 11 books on the shelf. He looked at the bark bundles above them, wrapped in their oilcloth, waiting. He looked at the plant they had found at the base of the south wall, the one Lucia did not have a name for. "He brought seeds with him," Hector said, "from Oaxaca. He brought seeds and he grew the plants he needed here." Lucia stood very still. "And the plant outside," she said, maybe one that was never introduced to any botanical record because the only person who grew it north of the Mexican border was Aurelio Salazar, in the margin of a limestone tannery on Cotula Creek, and nobody thought to ask what it was until today. They stood in the small locked room with the 11 books and the bark bundles and the faded tags with their Zapotec names, and outside through the narrow windows of the main workspace the South Texas afternoon was moving toward evening, and Cotula Creek was running low and clear over its limestone bed, and everything that had been locked in this room for 19 years had just been waiting for 2 specific people to arrive with the right equipment to understand it. If you have made it this far into Hector and Lucia Vela's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The news of what Hector and Lucia Vela had purchased traveled through Cotula the way news travels through any small South Texas county seat, which is to say immediately and with embellishment. By Friday morning, the story at the feed store on San Martin Avenue was that a retired shoe cobbler and his wife had paid county money for a collapsed building on the creek and were living in it, which was not accurate on any point, but was the version that circulated longest. By Friday afternoon, Bryce Fontaine had been asked about it at 2 separate locations, and had responded on both occasions with the patient tolerance of a man who has seen this kind of thing before and expects it to resolve itself in the form of a second public auction within 6 months. He told Norma Presley at the county clerk's office that he felt for the Velas. He genuinely did, but that some people reached a certain age and began making decisions that their children should probably be involved in. Norma Presley wrote that down in the way she wrote down everything Bryce Fontaine said, which was with complete accuracy and zero editorial comment, but she noted it nonetheless. The Cotula Courier ran a small item on page 4 of the Friday edition. The headline read, "Retired couple purchases creek property at surplus auction." The item noted the sale price of $400 and quoted Bryce Fontaine as saying the property had been a county liability for nearly 2 decades, and he was glad to see it change hands, though he hoped the new owners had done their due diligence. The item did not quote Hector or Lucia because the reporter had not called them. The reporter had called Fontaine. Their son, Marcos, called on Friday evening. He was 45 years old and worked as a civil engineer in Houston and had the particular anxiety of someone who loves his parents and has spent the last 3 years quietly calculating what their retirement savings could reasonably cover. He asked his father, with the careful calm of a man choosing each word, whether they had had the property assessed before purchasing it. Hector told him they had not. Marcos was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, that he thought it might be worth having someone come out and look at the structure before they invested any more time or money. "Come and look at it yourself," Hector said. "Come this weekend." Marcos said he had a project deadline. Hector said the property would still be there after the deadline. They agreed on the following weekend, which was an agreement that felt to Marcos like a postponement of an argument and to Hector like a reasonable arrangement. Their daughter, Pilar, called the following morning. She was 42 and taught high school biology in Laredo and was less measured than her brother, which was not always a disadvantage. She asked her mother directly if they had lost their minds, and Lucia said no, they had found them, and Pilar said that was exactly the kind of thing she was worried about. Lucia described the locked room. Pilar went quiet in the specific way of a biologist encountering something that interests her against her will. "An undocumented plant species," Pilar said. "Possibly," Lucia said. "I need the right reference materials to be certain." "Mama," Pilar said, "if you are right about that plant, you know what that means." "I know what it might mean," Lucia said, "which is why I need to be careful before I say what I think it is." Pilar called back 2 hours later and said she might be able to come the weekend after Marcos. Meanwhile, Hector and Lucia went back to work. This was their response to everything: the county's dismissal, Fontaine's public condescension, their children's worry, the feed store version of events. They did not argue any of it. They simply returned to the property every morning with what they needed and worked. Hector's first priority was the collapsed wall section. He had done masonry work in his early years before the leather craft became his profession, and stoneworking and leatherworking were not as different as they appeared, both requiring the specific patience of a person who understands that the material has its own logic and your job is to work with that logic rather than against it. He sourced matching limestone from a ranch property 2 miles east, where a stock tank dam had been rebuilt, and there was usable caliche block in the spoil pile. The rancher, a leathery, soft-spoken man named Eustacio Garza, who had known Hector's family in Carrizo Springs, let him have the block for the cost of loading it. Eustacio came to look at the Tannery property on the second day and stood for a long time looking at the limestone block work of the original construction. "Salazar built this," he said. It was not a question. "You knew the work," Hector said. "My grandfather brought hides here," Eustacio said, "in the 1940s, said there was nobody in the county who could do what Salazar did with leather." He looked at the collapsed wall section. He looked at Hector's tools. "You need help with the lifting," he said. It was not an offer. It was an observation that happened to be the same shape as an offer. This was how Eustacio Garza became the first ally. He came back the following Saturday with his truck and his grandson, and they lifted the heavier limestone blocks into position while Hector set the mortar. He worked as a man who helps because he sees something real, not because he feels sorry for anyone, and his help felt like respect and was accepted as respect. Lucia worked differently and in parallel, which was the only way she and Hector had ever worked on anything. While he addressed the structural envelope of the building she was working on, the botanical question, which was the question that ran beneath everything else and whose answer had implications, she was not yet ready to speak aloud to anyone outside this property. She had brought from her study the reference collection she had accumulated across 33 years of borderlands research. The floras, the ethnobotanical surveys, the specialist journals. She set up a work table in the main tannery workspace using a door blank across 2 sawhorses, which was the standard field desk of a scientist who has never had a budget for furniture. She photographed the unknown plant at the south wall in every light condition and from every angle. She took a small tissue sample using the collection protocol she had followed since her first field season and placed it in a sealed specimen envelope. She examined the bark bundles in the locked room one at a time, unwrapping each oilcloth package with cotton-gloved hands and making detailed notes on the material inside, comparing the bark specimens against Aurelio Salazar's written descriptions in the 11 leather books. This was slow work. It required the specific patience of a person who has learned that the difference between a correct identification and a plausible one is almost always a question of time spent looking. Lucia had that patience. She had been building it for 33 years. On the 3rd week, she found the bookmark. It was in the 7th of the 11 books, between pages 44 and 45. A piece of worked leather no larger than her thumb, hand-stitched along one edge in a fine cobbled stitch, the same stitch she had watched Hector use on the inside of a boot welt for 38 years. She turned it over. On the back, in Hector's handwriting, was a single line, "For the page where you find the one that changes everything." She sat on her stool at the work table and held the bookmark and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Hector," and he came from the wall section where he was working, his hands dusty with mortar, and she held it up. He had made it the night before, she realized. He'd gone to his small travel kit of leather tools that he always brought to any project, and he had cut and stitched it in the evening while she was reading Salazar's notebooks at the kitchen table, and he had put it in the book she was working on without saying anything. "How did you know it would be page 44? She said. "I did not know which page," he said. "I just knew you would find the right one." She turned back to page 45. She read it. She read to the end of the chapter. She set the book down. "This is it," she said. What Aurelio Salazar had documented on page 45 and the pages that followed was this. a plant he called by its Zapotec name first, and then in Spanish, and then with the description of a self-taught naturalist who understood that description was the only thing standing between knowledge and its loss. The plant had a tannin compound of extraordinary concentration. Salazar had been using it as the primary tanning agent in his finest leather work for 30 years, a concentration that produced a leather of unusual suppleness and durability, the specific quality that had made his work remarkable to everyone who encountered it. He had grown it from seeds brought from Oaxaca. He had grown it in the margin of his limestone tannery on Cotulla Creek because the microclimate at the base of the south wall approximated, closely enough, the conditions of the valley of Oaxaca. He had never sent a specimen to any institution. He had never sought a botanical name for it. He had simply grown it and used it and documented it in 11 handmade books in a locked room, and eventually died in 1971, 6 years after closing the tannery, and the door had stayed shut. Lucia already knew the plant at the south wall was a possible undescribed species. What she had not known until page 45 was that Salazar had been cultivating it continuously for 30 years, which meant the plant growing there now, in the margin of the tannery on Cotulla Creek, was a living specimen of the same line. It had survived 19 years of abandonment. It was still alive. And it was very possibly the only living specimen of this plant north of the Mexican border, and possibly one of a very small number anywhere, because the valley of Oaxaca land that had produced Salazar's seeds had been extensively replanted in the decades since he left. She sent the tissue sample to her former colleague at the Southwest Research Institute, a botanist named Dr. Reina Fuentes, with a note that was 3 sentences long and contained no speculation. She asked Reina to look at it without context and tell her what she found. She said she would provide context when Reina reported back. Reina called 8 days later. She said she did not know what it was. She said she thought Lucia should call someone at the Smithsonian. The complication arrived in the form of a letter from the county of Zavala, not from Bryce Fontaine personally, but from the county attorney's office in the 4th week of their work. The letter was courteous and specific, and it stated that the county's sale of the Cotulla Creek tannery property had been conducted without a full inventory of the property's contents, and that the contents of any locked interior space not specifically listed in the sale documentation might be considered county property pending a formal assessment. The letter requested that the Velas provide a full accounting of items found on the property, specifically including any materials in locked rooms, and asked them to hold those materials in place pending county review. Hector read the letter at the kitchen table. He read it twice. He set it down. "Fontaine," he said. "The county attorney," Lucia said. "But yes." "He heard something," Hector said. "Someone heard something," she said. "Counties do not send letters like this without a reason. Something was said to someone." Hector thought for a moment. He was not a man who made legal arguments, but he was a man who understood the difference between what was right and what was being claimed, and he had spent his whole life making things that were built to last because he believed the difference mattered. "The contents of a locked room we purchased the right to enter," he said, "are our property." "I believe so," Lucia said, "but I believe we need someone to say so with a law degree." She called their son Marcos that evening. Marcos, who was a civil engineer and not a lawyer, but who understood property rights and county procedure better than most people who are not lawyers, spent 2 hours that evening on the phone with a property attorney in San Antonio. The following morning, the attorney sent a letter to the county attorney's office that was 4 pages long and cited the specific Texas property statutes that governed the sale of county surplus assets and the transfer of property rights, including chattels. The letter also noted, with precise professional language, that the Velas were in contact with the Smithsonian Institution regarding items of potential national historical and scientific significance, which was not yet entirely true, but was becoming truer every day. The county's reply came in 10 days. It withdrew the claim to the contents of the locked room. Marcos drove down the following weekend. He arrived on a Saturday morning, and Hector took him through the tannery from the main door to the locked room and then to the south wall where the plant grew in the morning shade. Marcos stood in the locked room looking at the 11 leather books on the shelf and the bark bundles in their oilcloth wrappers, and he did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "How did you know?" "Your mother found the listing," Hector said. "I trusted the building." "You spent $400 on a hunch," Marcos said. "On a hunch and 46 years of knowing what your mother finds when she starts looking," Hector said. Marcos looked at the books. He looked at his father. He said, in the voice of a man revising something he had held with confidence, that he thought he should have come sooner. Hector said he had come, which was the thing that mattered. Pilar came the following weekend, as promised, and she and Lucia spent 4 hours at the work table with the specimen photographs and the reference texts and Salazar's notebooks, and Pilar, who had studied plant biology for 20 years and who had her mother's specific quality of scientific attention, agreed without qualification that the plant at the south wall was something that needed to be formally documented, and that the implications of Salazar's notebooks went considerably beyond the tannery. Bryce Fontaine did not visit in October. He drove past the property on the county road twice during the month because the county road ran along the north bank of the creek and the tannery was visible from it, and on both occasions he saw the lights on inside and the truck in the drive and the new limestone work visible on the south wall, and on both occasions he continued without stopping, which was the specific behavior of a man who has begun to suspect he may have been wrong about something and has not yet decided how to manage that suspicion. The transformation of the tannery took 11 months in total. Hector rebuilt the collapsed wall section, repointed the existing limestone block work throughout the building, repaired the roof at 2 points where the iron sheeting had separated, and restored the interior workspace to a condition that was functional and honest, showing what it had been without pretending to be something it was not. He rebuilt the hydrack rails from matching cedar. He cleared the cider encroachment from the property perimeter and opened the creek frontage. He did not hurry any of it because he understood, from a lifetime of working with materials that required patience, that rushing the material was always the most expensive possible option. Lucia did the botanical work and the archival work simultaneously, which was how she had always worked, 2 investigations running in parallel, each informing the other. The tissue sample went to Reina Fuentes, and then, through Reina's introduction, to a botanist at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History named Dr. Ignacio Peralta, who specialized in the plant families of Mesoamerica. Dr. Peralta's response to the photographs and tissue analysis was a phone call that lasted 40 minutes, and at the end of which he asked if he could visit the property. He drove from Washington to Cotula in January, which impressed Hector considerably, and spent 2 days at the tannery examining the plant at the south wall and the bark bundles and Salazar's 11 notebooks. Dr. Peralta confirmed what Lucia had suspected. The plant was an undescribed species in the genus Rus, the sumac family, with a tannin compound profile unlike any documented species in the Americas. It was not, he thought, a variety of any known species. It was something Aurelio Salazar had grown from seeds that represented a plant community in the valley of Oaxaca that had not been botanically surveyed before his departure and had since been significantly disrupted. The living specimens at Cotula Creek were, as far as Dr. Peralta could determine from the existing literature, the only living representatives of this species in a documented collection anywhere. And Salazar's notebooks were the only record of how the plant had been used, by whom, for what purpose, and what it produced. Dr. Peralta wrote this up. He wrote it up as a preliminary finding, properly hedged with the caution that characterized institutional science, and he sent it to 3 colleagues whose judgment he trusted and who agreed with his assessment. He then contacted the Smithsonian's American Latino History Initiative about the notebook specifically, because Aurelio Salazar's 31-year systematic record of Zapotec tanning practice in the Texas borderlands was in the assessment of the initiative's director, the earliest known documentation of indigenous Mexican tanning practice in the American Southwest. The notebooks were not just botanical, they were historical, they were ethnographic. They were, the director said, the kind of thing that got discovered once in a generation and that changed what the record said. The Smithsonian sent a letter to Hector and Lucia Vela in February. The letter formally acknowledged the significance of the Coachella Creek Tannery collection and proposed a partnership. The notebooks and bark specimens would be photographed and digitally archived by the Smithsonian at no cost to the Velas, the originals remaining on the property under Lucia's stewardship. The undescribed plant species would be formally described and named in the botanical literature, with Aurelio Salazar as the documented cultivator and Lucia Vela as the co-describer, in recognition of her role in bringing the specimen to scientific attention. The tannery property itself would be considered for nomination to the National Register of Historic Places as a site of significance to both Texas-Mexico borderlands history and American Latino heritage. Hector read the letter at the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he looked across the table at Lucia and said simply, "Aurelio Salazar. He deserved this." "He did," Lucia said. "And now he has it." The vindication came publicly in February of the following year, when the Smithsonian letter became the basis for a feature story in the San Antonio Express News. The reporter was a young woman named Valentina Cruz, who had grown up in Coachella and who understood exactly what it meant that two retired people had paid $400 for a building that the county assessor had publicly dismissed, and who wrote the story with the specific quality of someone who knows something important happened in a place she loves and wants to make sure it is recorded correctly. The Express news story ran on a Sunday and was picked up by Monday morning by the Associated Press and by Univision, and by Tuesday it had been read by approximately everyone in Zavala County, twice. The community of Coachella came to the tannery on the first Saturday in March. It was not a formal event. It was the specific organic gathering of a community that has processed something new about itself and wants to come and look at the place where the new thing happened. Eustacio Garza came and brought his wife and two grandchildren. Norma Presley came with her sister, a man named Humberto Delgado, who was 83 years old and whose grandfather had once brought hides to Aurelio Salazar, came in his truck with a daughter driving and stood in the tannery workspace for 20 minutes without speaking, and then said to Lucia that his grandfather had always said the leather that came out of this building was different from any leather he had ever held in his life, and that now he understood why that had been true. Bryce Fontaine came in the afternoon, which was how he came to things when he did not want to make an entrance. He walked through the restored workspace and the locked room with the notebooks and the bark bundles, and he stood for a long time at the south wall where Dr. Peralta had staked and labeled the living plant specimens. Hector came and stood beside him. "I told the courier it was the most expensive mistake two retired people had made in this county in recent memory," Fontaine said. "I remember," Hector said. "I was wrong about that," Fontaine said. He said it as a man who has practiced how to say something difficult and is now saying it and finding it costs exactly as much as he expected. "You were working from what you could see at the time," Hector said. "So were we. We just had more to go on." Fontaine looked at the staked plant. He looked at the limestone wall behind it, Hector's repointed mortar visible in the joints, the work honest and specific. "What did you have to go on?" he said. "My wife found the listing," Hector said, "and I trusted 46 years of knowing what she finds when she starts looking." Fontaine nodded. He put his hand out, and Hector shook it. Dr. Peralta's formal description of the new species was published in the journal Systematic Botany in April. The species was named Rus salazari after Aurelio Salazar, documented cultivator. The type specimen was designated as the living plant at the Coachella Creek Tannery, Zavala County, Texas. curated by Lucia Vela. In the acknowledgements, Dr. Peralta wrote that the discovery would not have been possible without the specific competence and specific partnership of two people who saw something in a $400 building that everyone else had spent 19 years not seeing. Marcos drove down for the publication. Pilar was already there. They stood together in the Tannery workspace where their father had rebuilt the limestone wall and their mother had set up her work table. And they looked at the restored space and the labeled plant against the south wall and the locked room with its 11 leather books behind glass. And they understood something about their parents that they had not understood before, which was not that their parents were capable, because they had always known that, but that their parents were, together, capable of something that neither of them was alone. The Tannery in its final form was this: a restored limestone building on the south bank of Cotulla Creek, the walls repointed and the roof sound, and the creek frontage cleared and open. The workspace showed the original vat pits and the hide rack rails and the beamwork overhead, the specific arrangement of a working tannery preserved and made legible. The locked room was behind low glass, the 11 leather books of Aurelio Salazar's notebooks displayed open to significant pages, the bark bundles in their Smithsonian-grade archival enclosures on the shelves above them. The plant, Rus Salazarii, grew in its original position at the base of the south wall under a small interpretive marker with Salazar's name and dates. Hector had one more thing to do. He had been saving it for the right moment, and the right moment was now. From his travel kit of leather tools, he took a piece of the leather he had brought from his workshop, the best piece he had, the hide he had been keeping for something worthy of it, and he cut and stitched a small panel that he attached to the doorframe of the locked room at eye height. On the panel, in the cobbled stitch that was his signature, he worked 2 sets of initials, AS on the left for Aurelio Salazar, HV and LV on the right for the 2 of them. Beneath the initials, also in stitch, 4 words in Spanish: Lo que el suelo guarda, what the earth holds. In the evening after the last visitors had gone, Hector and Lucia sat together on the low limestone step at the main entrance of the tannery, the March air cool off the creek, the light going warm and long across the South Texas scrub. Lucia had the shared notebook in her lap, the worn leather-bound book that had held 46 years of their decisions. She opened it to the page she had written on the day of the auction, the day she had written Cotulla Creek Tannery, $400, March, and left the rest of the page blank for what they would find. She picked up her pen. She wrote for a moment. She handed it to Hector. He read what she had written. He held the notebook in his large hands, his arthritis steady as it always was in the warm evening air, and he looked across the limestone step at the plant at the south wall. Rus Salazarii, still alive in the fading light, the only one of its kind in any documented collection in the world, alive here on Cotulla Creek because one man brought its seeds north from Oaxaca in 1931 and planted them in the margin of the thing he was building, and because 2 other people came along 80 years later with the right eyes to see what they were. What Lucia had written was this: he planted it because he believed someone would come who could read it. We came. We read it. That was what $400 had bought. Not the building. Not even what was inside the building. The chance to be the people who finally understood what someone else had spent a lifetime making sure was not lost. I want to know how this story sat with you. Leave it in the comments below. Whatever it stirred in you, it belongs there, and I want to read it. Tell me where you are watching from today. This story began in a limestone building on a creek in South Texas, and it has found you wherever you are, and I want to know where that is. And I want to ask you something this story left me thinking about. Has there ever been something in your life, a place, a skill, a piece of knowledge, a way of doing a thing, that everyone around you called worthless until you or someone you loved proved them wrong? Not loudly, not for anyone watching, just quietly, by doing it right until the evidence was undeniable. Tell me about that. This community holds those stories with the care they deserve. Thank you for being here for Hector and Lucia. The next story is already waiting, and I think it will stay with you.